to a new episode of Himalayan Crossroads, a podcast series on the tallest, youngest, and most dynamic mountain range in the world. I'm your host for today, Saniko Niktajan, and behind the scenes we have our amazing co-host Swati Chauhan, who's helping us with tech and logistics support. Thank you so much, Swati. Today I'm very excited to introduce my advisor and our very esteemed guest, Professor Sandeep Banerjee, who is an associate professor of global Anglophone and world literature at McGill University. Professor Banerjee's research focuses on the literary and cultural worlds of colonial and post-colonial South Asia, with multilingual expertise in the long 19th century. Professor Banerjee has written extensively on literary and visual cultures of aestheticizing human and environmental entanglements. He's perhaps most well known for his book, Space, Utopia, and Indian Decolonization, Literary Prefigurations of the Post-Colonial, where he examined the utopian desires and representation of decolonization. He's currently completing his second monograph, Heights of Fantasy, Imagining the Himalaya in Colonial Capital Scene, where he explores the changes in cultural conceptions of Himalaya between 1770 and 1950. Welcome, Professor Banerjee, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much. It is our great pleasure to have you and to learn from your insights. Maybe to start, we could talk a little bit about how you got interested in the Himalaya and the research in general.
Well, I think the Himalayas came into my life, as it were, in a bizarre way with my grandmother, who made a pilgrimage to Kedarnath when I was in junior school. And she decided to go on her own in this kind of, with a group of tourists. You know, it was one of those organized pilgrimage tourism kind of thing. And apart from just having been culturally sort of being exposed to it, you know, on the one hand because of Hinduism and its associations with the Himalaya and with Tenzing. So when and Jim Corbett. So it's kind of like three very disparate figures, you know, Shiva, the Hindu god, Tenzing, and Corbett, three kind of god with two minor gods, as it were, flitting about in the imagination. Then my grandmother decided to go there, and I remember when she came back, I asked her, and everyone was very kind of concerned that she said she went off on her own, with a, you know, single woman going into this hard and hardy terrain. Everyone was very concerned.
Just to clarify, did you mean Tenzing Norgay?
Yes,
okay.
yes,
Okay.
Tenzing and Jim Corbett. So you read about their exploits, and you. So in fact, coming back to Tenzing, there was this documentary when I was a child, which Doordarshan had, Tigers of the Snow, I think, on Tenzing. Which, Tenzing was a cultural icon growing up in Calcutta. And just to like see it, you know, see the man strutting about in Darjeeling. So that just kind of puts you in touch. And the other thing is there's also a very long tradition of travel writing in Bengali on the Himalayas. So that's also something we were exposed to as a child. So I guess this whole range of inputs, if you will, kind of got one interested.
Yeah. So what I'm sensing is that there's already a cultural immersion that you have with Himalaya through travelers, but also through your personal. So
Yeah, personal life, and then I went with my parents to the Garhwal, which was much later, and then subsequently when I lived in Delhi, I used to go trekking about twice or thrice a year. So and in that that last leg from 2005 onwards, I also got to, I guess, make friends with some people from Garhwal, and I've gone back since. In fact, last year when I went to Garhwal with my wife, we stayed with Biru, who was a very dear friend of mine, at his village, and so stayed there, cooked. Well, just like so, and he's come and visited me in Delhi. So there's also kind of a there's a cultural immersion which gets deepened with sort of travel, and then you actually meet people and you develop a kind of sense of familiarity with the place. So it's kind of a process.
Yeah, definitely. Can we talk a little bit more about what you said, the familiarizing part of the process? Because I know that a lot of your work is focused on the distinction between space and place making as processes. So maybe we could talk more specifically about
think one of the ways of thinking about this decision to go back to space and place, as you brought up, is to think of space as a kind of space is understood to be a kind of an abstract category, and place something which is space inscribed with meaning, which you're more attached to, with which you have a more intimate relationship. And oftentimes one hears of, with the advent of capitalism and all the rest of it, you move from sort of rooted notions of place to a more abstract notion of space, and then over time you inscribe that abstract space with your own meanings, and you kind of move it back to place, right? So that's one of the ways I think about it. I mean, for me, the Himalaya was the latter part of that process, I should say. The Himalaya was a kind of idea, and then you go there and you as I said, you travel through the place, you see the people there, you see the landscape, and you see the transformation in the land, because it's all very well to kind of talk about how beautiful it is, how aesthetic it is, but you also see a kind of a lived transformation of that place because of tourism. So there's a remarkable kind of transformation in the infrastructure. So it's a more comfortable place now for outsiders like me, but it comes at a certain cost. So there's a lot more use of cement, for instance. There's better roads, but that also means more waste and garbage. So it's also kind of seeing that kind of space making, place making at a personal level, but also at a societal level. So, yeah.
I think it's, I want to follow up more on this idea of transformation that you're talking about, whether that's the use of cement or the more urbanization in that sense. But could we go back to what you said, Himalaya as an idea? What does that mean as an idea, like aesthetically, conceptually?
So in the book that I'm writing, I'm trying to actually look at certain tropes that emerge in the colonial era, through which we begin to make sense of the Himalaya, and those tropes stay with us, and we continue to make sense of the Himalaya through those tropes. And what my book is trying to do is trying to, as it were, culturally map the mountains. So it's the Himalaya as a sacred geography. This predates, of course, colonialism, but it gets recast in a certain way in the colonial era. It becomes a site of colonial habitation, like the construction of the hill stations. It becomes construed as, on one hand, nature's garden, untouched by human hands, and a place for human plantations, where it's nature produced through human intervention. It's seen as an empty space, that needs to be mapped, but at the same time it is inscribed with meaning of certain kinds, like it becomes seen as the Himalaya as the border between India and Tibet, India and Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So there are different ways in which, or different inscriptions, cultural inscriptions that the Himalaya undertake. And in fact, the specific idea of Himalayan aesthetic, this idea of this beautiful place, right, with its own kind of views, etc. This is also happening from the 19th through the 19th century. So these are the different sort of ways in which we think about the Himalaya, and in many ways, as I said, these modes of engaging, perceiving, conceiving, the Himalaya stays with us, and we can't think about the mountains beyond this, or in an anthropological vein that, there are a bunch of locals living here, or whatever, which is what you see the colonial travelers write about, and then subsequently Indians follow their way.
I think this idea of the colonial inscription of the place is particularly important, because you mentioned hill stations, and you mentioned how how we're talking about settlement and how we're talking about the sacred geography has changed. Could we talk a little bit more in the context of this time period then? In the sense that I think around the 18th and 19th century, everything that you mentioned, not just Himalaya, I think the larger landscape is becoming a place of nature and wilderness and everything that we talked about, like a sacred, sublime spot. How does the Himalaya figure in this larger context?
So if you think of the colonial transformation on the aesthetic paradigm, one of the things that happens is the Himalaya comes or becomes an important site in the wake of the Alps being established in Europe as a premier site of cultural inscription. So from the 18th century onwards, or by the time we come to the 18th century, what we have is this kind of explosion of the Grand Tour. So people from England are going to the continent, traveling around, and also traveling around in the Alps. So if you think of writing about mountains, in many ways the first mountaineering tract is written by someone called Petra, who we don't think of as a mountaineer. He goes up Mount Ventoux and he writes about, oh, this is, if I'm not mistaken, I'm digressing from thinking about God and thinking about this creation. There's a very famous book written in the first half of the 1950s, Marjorie Nicholson's Mountain Gloom, Mountain Glory, which tracks this kind of transformation in the mountain aesthetic. And one of the things that she shows is that the mountains were seen as kind of warts and pimples in the face of God's great creation, to, by the time we come to the Romantic period, to be seen as this kind of preeminent natural formation, which provoke the mind and imagination and the rest of it. So there's a kind of transformation. So because of the Grand Tour historically, the Alps come into sort of cultural preeminence in Europe. And you also have painters like Turner painting the Alps and sort of alpine journeys, and then Ruskin lecturing on it. In fact, the term, the title Mountain Gloom, Mountain Glory is taken from Ruskin's modern painters, the two sections. And Ruskin talks about there being two kind of traditions of talking about the mountains, where the mountains are seen as he says, glory, mountain glory. But what is important is once the Europeans start sort of painting, photographing, writing about the Alps, they start looking elsewhere. And India is, by this time, this is, say, the mid-19th century, very much a colonial possession. And sort of the interest shifts from the Alps to the Himalaya. So by the second half of the 19th century, when photography is established, actually even before that, you have people like the Daniel brothers painting it. You have Nina Mazzucchelli in 1876, one of the first women travelers in not just in the Himalayan region, but she's actually traveling from what is now, say, northern Bengal into Bhutan and Sikkim. So, and she writes about, in fact, her narrative is called How We Crossed the Indian Alps. And the Alps is both used in, I imagine, the sense of the European mountain range, but also in the technical sense of the Alps. That, this is a kind of a very glaciated, fold mountain range that has been crossed. She's one of the first people to write about it. She's also one of the first people to paint them. So you have a whole range. So this is just one of the few people who end up producing, one of the few people of the entire body of writers and painters and eventually photographers start producing accounts, visual and textual accounts of the Himalayas. So the other greatly important, and I think a very, very important figure is Samuel Bone. Samuel Bone comes to India from Nottingham in about 1860. So with the development of painting and registers of aesthetics on the Alps, and once the interest in the Alps gets crystallized, it also then gets translated into India, or rather onto the Himalaya, because it's part of India, it's part of the colonial possession. And only in the early 19th century there is a development that this might be the highest mountain range, because people still thought the Andes was the highest. So Alexander Gerard and others, they're mapping over the altitude of the peaks and saying, I think it's not the Alps, it's these. And there's, by the mid-19th century and later, there is a consensus that these are the highest mountains. But you also have, with the development of a certain register of painting and writing about the Alps, a kind of Himalayan aesthetic, which you see in the paintings of Turner, in the lectures and subsequent writings, and also sketches of Ruskin. Ruskin is not just a lecturer, he's also a brilliant artist. And these get translated, as it were, projected onto India. So, and when photography comes to India, this is taken up in a big way. So Samuel Bourne, for instance, becomes a very important photographer. He's one of the first people. This is in the 1870s. He's actually traveling to what we now call Gomo. So these are probably the first images, as far as I can tell, first photographs of the Gangotri Glacier and Gomo. So this is around 1872, 76, and that decade. This is also the time you have Nina Mazzucchelli, who's one of the first women travelers in the Himalaya, but in what is now North Bengal, and she goes into Bhutan, into Sikkim. She paints these places, writes about them. So you see a certain emergence of a register of writing about, talking about, painting the Himalaya, which is drawing on largely ideas of the picturesque, which is how the Alps is dominantly portrayed. Bourne is using this in a certain register, kind of, we call it the colonial picturesque. And by the time the 20th century comes around, you have the attempt to scale, climb the various peaks. And Everest gets finally climbed in the 1950s. So there's a kind of attempt at representing, depicting, and also in a sense domesticating the mountains. And the hill stations give you another very powerful instance of where the aesthetic and the domestication, both of them come together, because the hill stations are constructed very much in the image of British towns through the lens of the picturesque. So, and it's not just little towns that look like a slice of England in India. We actually have the development of the neighborhood, the neighboring, the surrounding areas along the picturesque logic. So you have wooded areas being developed for hunting. Sometimes lakes are dug up for fishing, like in Shillong, the lake is artificial. It's going to dig it up, and they, because water is a very important part of the picturesque, so they're going to bring it in. And what also happens is the Britishers bring in a bunch of trees from outside, plants, so pines from eucalyptus from Australia, pines from Europe, but also Japan. Some of this is invasive, like eucalyptus in Bangalore. It's now been banned because it sucks up all the groundwater. Foreign pine also has a lot of oil, so it causes fire. So there's a whole bunch, and this is also the start of a certain kind of urbanization that you mentioned, right? It's less invasive than what one sees now, but nevertheless, this is the start of a process. I'm always kind of this one part, I teach the novel Kim of Kipling, but there's one bit of Kim which always strikes me every time I read it. So all the action is done, and India has been saved, and the French and the Russians and all has been sorted out, and the map has been rescued and the rest of it. And then Kim chucks these three things, three baskets or something, into the valley. Right? It's kind of a remarkable moment of a depiction of waste, for absolutely gratuitous, like three baskets being chucked in. I mean, and when you go to the Himalaya now and you see this, like as I said, I was there last summer, 2025 summer, and we went up trekking, my wife and I, to this remote shrine called Matya Maheshwar. And one of my friends was talking to her on the phone. She said, "Oh, I went there in the 90s. Did they tell you to make a lot of noise coming down to make sure you're not attacked by bears?" And I said, "No, what I saw was actually a bunch of pilgrims going up with boombox in hand. So there was no question of sort of making a noise to keep the bears away, because bears were already being kept away." So yeah, this is kind of the transformation where aesthetics and this kind of cultural inscription kind of comes in some ways to haunt us. And the stories of the landslides, which are only, I shouldn't call them stories, the landslides that one encounters and hears about, reads about, has only just become more frequent. I think a month that we haven't had a landslide.
It's been rapid and getting worse, obviously. But I also, there were so many points I think that I wanted to come back to as you were discussing how the landscape has changed, transformed, and also like the reference, the literary justice that we see in Kim about the production of waste. But I was curious, what we're talking about, this cultivation of an image, or the aesthetics of Himalaya, almost mirroring that of Alps, or at least trying to reflect that. Is this something that we see across other fold mountains in the world as well, or is this a particularly colonial legacy that's happening because it's a possession of the British Empire?
Well, I don't know enough to talk about the Rockies and the Andes, but what I can say is that they're also important sites for cultural inscriptions. Mountains, like all other natural formations, deserts or seas or oceans, or forests, are important sites of cultural inscription. What I can say about the Himalaya, though, is that, well, there are several things to be said. One is the Himalaya is a kind of shared cultural space. So if you see, it goes all the way from the Burmese mountain ranges, or the bits of the Himalaya that go into Burma and what we call Northeast India, to all the way to Central Asia, to the Pamir Knot, the Hindu Kush, yeah, and then beyond. They're not really considered part of the Himalayan system, like the Altai and the Kundalum Shan, but they're very much part of the larger cultural imaginary. So now this cultural imaginary is shared, as I said, Central Asia, Tibet, China, you have Chinese Turkestan, there's what is now the Xinjiang province of China, you have Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kashmir, the northern territories, all the kind of the normative Indian states, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, and Assam, North Bengal, Manipur, Nagaland. So and this is a kind of a pretty disparate geography, and a very disparate physical and a very disparate cultural geography. So that makes it a very contested space, and at times politically contested. It's most certainly the most militarized mountain system in the world. I mean, no other place has a mountain range being coveted or shared, in a sense, by three nuclear-armed neighbors. That makes it particularly special. No other mountain range, as far as I know, is shared, whose sovereignty is divided among so many constituents. And so there are interesting overlaps, like, for instance, the Yeti, which is the shared cultural symbol in Nepal, in Tibet, in Bhutan, in Sikkim. So there's a shared system of signifying this mythical animal across cultures. And then different people see the mountains in a different way, right? Like K2 is central now to a certain kind of Baltistan, Pakistan imagination of the Himalaya, the way the Kanchenjunga is for a certain part of India, and the Chokhamba is, or the Nanda Devi is for another part of India and Nepal. And speaking of Nanda Devi, there's also supposedly or not, I mean, not supposedly, there is a nuclear device, a plutonium device somewhere in the Nanda Devi Glacier, lost by the CIA and the Indian mountaineers from the 1960s.
Is this in fact? That
Yes, yes, yes.
Oh.
They tried to put a antenna or something to spy on the Chinese, and they lost the plutonium powered batteries.
In the plutonium somewhere in
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is it's been there since the mid '60s. So this makes it, as I said, a site of immense cultural, but not only cultural inscription and transformation. There's a recent New York Times article on it, and there's a older, very good caravan cover story on this actually as well.
Actually, that brings me back to what we were talking about earlier, transformation, because we covered more so about how we're cultivating images from the Alps or more about European discovery. But could we talk a little bit more about, say, from the regional context?
So I just thank you, because I meant to also address that. So the other thing that is important about the Himalayas is that it is, by virtue of there being so many contenders, I don't think it's just simply a colonial repetition of the alpine aesthetic. That's the origin story. That, I mean, or that's a kind of a condition of possibility. But you see this getting transformed, this aesthetic getting transformed in the Himalaya in very decisive ways. So, like I said, Samuel Bowen is aware of the picturesque aesthetic in England, in Europe. When he comes to India, he's deploying the picturesque, but he's also in his travelogues writing repeatedly about how difficult it is to do picturesque photography with the Himalaya, because they're just like, the peaks are gigantic in comparison. So you see a kind of constant reckoning, as it were, and a constant transformation of that aesthetic. So, so what I'm trying to draw attention to is that people, at least the English and the Europeans, were depicting in textual or in visual domains the Himalaya because it was fashionable. But that doesn't mean they were necessarily replicating it. They were drawing on those paradigms, and they were getting changed in its own way. So, to give you another very different example, so the hill stations, which have been built in a certain picturesque way, to the point that, you know, there's this very famous line by, I think, the Viceroy Lytton, who comes to Ooty and he says, "Oh, such delicious English rain, such delicious English mud," because he just kind of can't see beyond the Englishness of the place. But 1890s, Curzon, he's not yet the Viceroy of India, he's come visiting, he comes to Shimla, and he's like, "Oh, I didn't realize there were," and you see this in his private papers in the India Office records. I didn't, you know, Shimla was pretty much what I accepted, except I didn't realize there were so many Indians here. There was such a large native population. He writes about it. So you have a certain kind of ideological production of this as this kind of pure, pristine place of Englishness, and then that is undercut by the reality of, yes, it's an English place, but with a whole bunch of Indian servants, cooks, gardeners, you know, who are necessary to prop up this lifestyle. And you have historians who've written about this, Dame Kennedy's work, I can think of. So, so this is the way, you know, the mountains get transformed, and the aesthetic itself gets transformed.
Can we talk a little bit about this aesthetic that's getting transformed from, I think you mentioned the Yeti, for instance, right, as a symbol that connects regionally, as a signifier that is probably, is that also picking up from the Alps, or is there like a different narrative?
No, that is indigenous. I mean, indigenous to, and I don't mean indigenous in the kind of the way Canadians use indigenous, but indigenous in the sense in the local. So there's a Nepali term for the Yeti, there's a Tibetan term for the Yeti, there's a Sikkimese, Bhutanese term for the Yeti. So, but it's kind of a shared cultural icon in a sense, right? And in many ways is the figure that connects the physical aspects, the physical dimension of the Himalayan space to a more ethereal kind of supernatural dimensions. It's kind of a transitional figure in a sense, or kind of a transitional, but also someone kind of a figure that holds these two dimensions together. And but you see the Yeti come up in very interesting ways in European discourse, as it were. So on one hand, Yeti's footprints are seen in the 1930s by Smythe, is the one who discovers the Valley of Flowers, and then photographs the footprints and all the rest of it. And then you see Tintin in Tibet. You see a very, very, and by the way, the term the English or the Europeans use for the Yeti is the abominable snowman, which is a bizarre, and from what I understand, a mistranslation. So the Yeti in Hergé's comic is actually someone who shows more humanity in a sense than some of the humans. He's the one who takes care of Chang, Tintin's friend, and then is quite upset when Chang is, as it were, rescued. And in a sense, if you see the Tintin series, Tintin's relationship with the wider environment and the non-humans in the first one of the series, Tintin in Congo, is deeply problematic. It's downright racist. But there is a transformation in the character of Tintin. When we come to Tintin in Tibet, there's a, it is still a kind of a white savior narrative, but it's also a white savior narrative that undercuts itself. So that's what makes, I think, Tintin in Tibet really exciting. And the other thing about Tintin in Tibet is that it's an album with no villains. No one is a villain in there. It's a very interesting album. There's no Rastapopoulos. So that's another way in which that kind of circulates, if you will, the image of the Yeti. And in fact, the Yeti is, in Tibet is almost presented as a kind of primitive man, which is to say human. So it's kind of an extension of the human. So, yeah.
Yeah. So there were two things that I wanted to sort of expand more, because this is a very fascinating reading of the Yeti, right? Because one is this idea of transformation, and if we juxtapose this with the image of this picturesque, for instance, how is the figure of the Yeti, from what we're talking about now, it could be the abominable, it's like a hostile, but also a generous, also benevolent, humane figure in that sense. So how would we juxtapose that with the image of the picturesque, almost having this image of it's a terrain that you're not going to encounter anybody, right? Like from the picturesque wilderness situation that we have from a more pristine influence, cultural description. And the other is this idea of the Himalaya as a site of discovery in general, individually. So as a place where you go for pilgrimage, as a place where you go for adventure, but at the end of the day, a place where you go to find yourself away from society and social corruption in that sense.
Let's try and answer the first question first. So if you think of the category of the picturesque, it's often seen as a mediating category between the sublime and the beautiful. So in some ways, the picture, or if you think of the Himalaya is in a sense sublime. It's daunting. You can die there. It is threatening, and this threatening space, in its picturesque rendition, is actually domesticated. This is true of the Alps as well, but the use of picturesque is different in the two contexts. There are similarities, but there are also important differences. So going back to Bourne, for instance, Bourne will often scale down, by virtue of capturing a certain mountain, he, by definition, scales down the mountain fit it in a frame, right? So that's kind of the way the picturesque, domesticates the mountains at one level. But at the same time, if people have written about how the picturesque screens out, the unseemly, screens out danger. So you see that in Bone. These pretty pictures of these daunting mountains. But you also see porters often being used as a kind of visual counterpoint to the immensity of the mountains. So to produce scale, but at the same time you also kind of follow the copybook. It's almost like textbook definition of putting them in not so much as the dark side of the landscape, as John Carroll would tell us, but kind of literally scaling them down. So they just become dots, quite literally dots in the horizon. Now, what is happening is there are two registers of reduction here. One is of the immensity of the mountains and of the human presence. Now, you don't see a lot of humans in Bone's photographs, though he writes about how in one trip he has 70 coolies going with him, right? But you don't see them at all. So these conditions of possibility of his travel are kind of effaced. But if you read his writings, you will see he's traveling in Kashmir, he's traveling in what is now Uttarakhand, and he's traveling in Himachal. And he is writing relentlessly about how these places are dirty, how there's not enough food, how he's talking about the locals, but you don't see them in the paintings. The photographs. So there's a kind of screening effect at work here. So this is a very different register of where, in a sense, colonialism meets the aesthetic to produce a certain image of this space. And it goes hand in hand with the evacuation of locals when hill stations are produced, right? So it's a different order of screening. And this fantasy that is produced of these places being racially pure, this is sort of a slice of home in a place away from home. So that's one of the ways in which this transformation works. The same thing is about discovery. There is, of course, an older sense of the sacred location, the Himalayas being connected to Kailash being the abode of Shiva, but also Kedarnath is where, Shankaracharya, the Adi Shankaracharya passes away and is supposedly vanishes the wilderness, as it were. And before that, of course, the Pandavas go up, to the heavens through the Himalayas. So it's kind of the liminal space between this world and that world, and the world beyond. So it becomes part of very much the Hindu sacred geography and also the Buddhist sacred geography and Bon sacred geography in Tibet. So that's one circuit. And when you see the English come, they are contending with, on one hand, the received notion of the Himalaya as a kind of unknown space, terra incognita, which needs to be mapped, learned about, understood. And on the other hand, this kind of an already culturally inscribed space. So it's both an empty space and not an empty space, because there are cultural inscriptions, like I said, sacred geography, but also more importantly, there are local habitations here, right? You have villages in these locations. So there's a constant negotiation between both these registers. So you have exploration, but you also have kind of an anthropological eye being deployed to understand how these people are. And this goes all the way back to the first Tibet mission of George Bogle by Warren Hastings. Bogle sets off from Calcutta, and if you see, he writes about Tibet and meeting Teshu Lama, as the British call him, Panchen Lama, and all the rest of it. But the list that Warren Hastings gives George Bogle is just outstanding. I want this. One of them is goats which give the tush, which is used for making shawls, and a yak or if or freshly packed walnuts or a walnut tree, if you can send it, and it's just remarkable to read it and find it says.
Sorry, who's this addressed to?
Bogle is the diplomat who goes to negotiate the first kind of trade agreement with Tibet. This is in 1774. So that's kind of the origin story of this kind of Himalayan thing. Now, this starts a process where by the time we come to the Great Game, which is the kind of geopolitical maneuvering of the Russian and the British empires, this gives a huge fillip to sort of mapping the Himalaya, because the British Indian government is paranoid that the Russian Empire will invade British India and it will come through Central Asia and Tibet. So the Russians are also going and mapping Central Asia and Tibet, and thus the Himalayas for the British. So this gets a fillip, and this leads to the very bloody invasion of Tibet by the British Indian Army in I think 1905 or 1903-4. This is led by Young Husband, very famous figure. So this is with the blessing of Curzon. He goes, the Dalai Lama flees, and Lhasa falls to an invading army, not for the first time in the 20th century. But this is the first time this happens. This is going to be repeated later on. But this is actually a culmination of a long tradition of espionage across the Himalaya, right? You have Pandit Nain Singh, Sharat Chandra Das, Pandit Krishna, Gyan Gyat. So all these people being trained in the Indian, I think the Trigonometric Service Office in Dehradun, and sent across by Colonel Montgomery, and sent across the mountains dressed as pilgrims, where they're counting their steps, boiling water, with prayer wheels which have compasses and sextants in it, and measuring the thing. So they're boiling water because water boils at 100 degrees at sea level. So calculating the boiling point of water, they're actually calculating the altitude. So this is how Lhasa is mapped. This is how the Brahmaputra, the upper valley of the Brahmaputra, the Sangpo Valley, is actually surveyed by a bunch of Indians who are counting their paces. So counting paces is basically you are trained to walk in a certain way, where say 1 meter is 5 steps. So then you count, right? So if I walked 100 paces, it means 100 divided by 520, so I walk 20 meters. This is how we map the routes and everything. So this is kind of a fascinating project of discovery, not so much self-discovery, but a kind of a discovery exploration. This is connected to the fascination with Tibet that happens at the start of the 20th century. So like the word great, the phrase Great Game is popularized by Kipling's Kim. The word Shangri-La is popularized by James Hilton's Lost Horizon, which comes out in the 1930s. It's a monastery where people don't age in somewhere in Tibet. And that creates its own kind of craze and what have you, utopia. And so that gives you a certain kind of prehistory of the the flower power generation going to find itself from in this kind of capitalist claptrap. So so there are these two kind of agendas that go hand in hand, and you're going to see sometimes this kind of, let's call the first, this exploration, social discovery and personal discovery coming together in figures like Nikolai Roerich, who's painting these Himalayan landscapes with bright colors which are suffused with color to kind of signal this kind of the soul or spiritual awakening, if you will.
When you mentioned flower power, did you mean like the larger conversation about like the beatnik?
Yes. So I'm saying that this anticipates that.
Yeah.
because they're the ones who will really go out, they'll be coming to Rishikesh and Benares and the Himalaya to find themselves. And now, in the contemporary moment, Israeli Defense Force, army people come to find themselves after serving in Israel. So that finding themselves continues. Young husband is a very interesting case because young husband goes on essentially like his military goes on a killing spree in Tibet, and then as he's coming back, he writes about how he's seen such beauty that he can never feel ill will for any other people, and then he becomes a bit of a hippie from what I understand. So writing about aliens, but he's also kind of leading the expedition commissions and encourages Mallory to climb the mountain. So it's kind of there's a very interesting and very interesting intertwined histories of colonialism, capitalism, discovery, and all the rest of it.
Would you say then that through these expeditions, through these, whether that's scaling, elevation, or espionage, or all of these different various enterprises that are being taken up, would you say that they're sort of mapping a secularization of this sacred geography? Because they're doing a similar process, but the narrative has changed.
I don't know if I would call it secularization because the Himalaya is a lived entity for people forever. I mean, so the sacrality is a form of cultural inscription. The secularization is also a kind of cultural inscription. So I'd say the Himalayas are. The Himalaya is. Depending on, I use the singular generally in my articulations. So the Himalaya is, and one imagines it, one inscribes it with a sacral quality, and for very good reason. Or one sees it as a place to live, to build, to cultivate, to be in. And the Himalaya, I'm always fascinated by this line. I think it's from one of the Puranas, and which I always think about when I think about the mountains, the Himalaya. Which is, even if I had 1,000 lives, I could not speak of the glory of your creation. And I think that's really what it is, and now it could be understood in a secular registration or in a slightly different way, but it is a very beautiful place, and aestheticized or otherwise, just seeing the sun fall on the snow-capped peaks is just one of the most remarkable outcomes of the Big Bang. Is how I would put it.
Yes.
It might be divine or it might not be, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Actually, maybe we can talk a little bit more about your personal investment in this transformation that's happening. In the sense that we've talked, this interest that you have in the Himalaya. Do you see in your work, or in your own trips that you've had more recently, how has the place transformed in a more contemporary moment?
I have to say it is now, so I've been going as an adult pretty regularly, I would say, from 2005. I've traveled before with my parents already, but 2005 I've been, and mostly in Garhwal. And the most recent time I have gone is 2025 summer. In some ways it has transformed for the better. It has Sorry, I'm usually not this popular. I don't know why I'm super popular.
Start.
So I have been going to the Himalaya regularly since 2005 as an adult. I've gone before with my parents, but from 2005 I've been going pretty regularly. I also, so in 2013 there was a massive cloud burst in Kedarnath. And as I said, I have friends in that neighborhood now. So I went in 2014 and I saw the devastation firsthand. It was a year later. And I was going up in the jeep and I remember telling the driver that एक गाँव था. There was a village here. And he said, हाँ था. Yes, there was. So I said, कहाँ गया? Where did it go? He said, नीचे, pointing to the river. And so, just to translate for your viewers, he said, down there, pointing to the river. So, and I remember this stretch. It was like this. It's like going through any North Indian shopping, like Meerut or whatever. And this entire village had vanished.
Is it submerged?
It had fallen off into the river. So this is, and you also travel through and you see these bridges, which are suspension bridges, which have been like literally ripped in half by the water. And the first thing that struck me is like, it is a very deep gorge. How much water is needed to push a bridge, off kilter here? But so you see that kind of destruction. So as I would say, life has become better in some ways. It's more comfortable, both for locals and for people outside. But at the same time, I think it comes with a certain, the much abused word, cost. So if you go to Srinagar, Srinagar is the capital of Tehri Garhwal, not the Kashmir Srinagar. A dam has been built, which looks like a mini Hoover Dam. But this has been built on the Alaknanda, which is two rivers merge to form what we call the Ganga or the Ganges, Alaknanda and the Bhagirathi. The Bhagirathi comes from Gangotri, the glacier, and it's of a more barren nature, like the valley is more barren. Alaknanda is a very green, fertile valley. And this dam has necessarily turned the river into a swimming pool. So, one imagines that it produces electricity for Delhi, I imagine. But it also has an impact, I imagine, on the ecosystem around. So like that, and like this summer, when I went to Madhmeshwar, they're extending the motorable road. Earlier it used to be a 6-day trek. Now it has become a 3-day trek, and eventually it'll become probably a 1-day trek because the last stretch is just not motorable, right? That's, who knows, I wouldn't want the curse of motorability to come to that part. But yeah, so as I said, it comes with some developments, but it also has an impact. I've met people who said, "Yeah, हमारे गुजरात होता तो यहाँ पे रोप पे चलता है." This was Gujarat, there would have been a rope. That is probably a good thing for some people, but maybe not the best solution, perhaps. I don't know. It's just what I'm trying to say is that there is a kind of transformation which aids the lives and livelihoods in a certain way, but it also detracts from the lives and livelihoods in other ways.
I think that bit about how time, like we take less time now to travel the same road. It's that space-time compression.
It is space-time compression, but it is also a certain kind of compression of the mind, I guess, because why go to the mountains if you want to have your kurkure and Lay's chips? This is what I think. But then the locals want their kurkure and Lay's chips, there's also that.
Yeah.
And now this is a kind of ethical quandary one can only think about and wonder and think about what is the ethical way forward.
If you think about that, a pilgrimage usually supposed to be full of hardship in that sense. Like it's not an easy journey. and to travel to such remote places?
I will say one thing though. There might be some things for other countries to learn from a place like Bhutan. So 2 years ago, I had the good fortune to go up the Tiger's Nest Monastery with my wife. And what I saw was they have made the trek safer without necessarily making it more accessible. So it's difficult, it retains its difficulty, but they made it safer. And that's a nice balance, I think, that is struck there between the iconicity of that place as a tourist destination, but also that place as a kind of sacred locale. That you want people to come, but you don't want it to become a kind of neighborhood mall.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that we don't need everything to be modified to become a mall, to become a Disney entertainment amusement park in that sense. So thank you so much. I think that brings us to an end to such a fascinating conversation. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for joining us in our latest episode. This was Professor Sandeep Banerjee telling us about how the Himalayas have been influenced, but also have influenced our general idea of the picturesque, of mobility, and also how it's transformed over time. Thank you so much, and we'll see you